holds true in both the northern and southern hemisphere, respectively. With all of that in mind, let's look at this paper that was just published titled Longer Wavelengths in Sunlight Pass Through the Human Body, which have a systemic impact, which improves vision. And it's no surprise that Glenn Jeffrey and Bob Fosbury would look at vision since they're in the Department of Ophthalmology. They have the tools to actually look at that. But it's important to understand that because as we'll talk about, vision and the ability to see color specifically is highly dependent on very good activity of mitochondria in the retina. By the way, the retina is the tissue in the body with the highest concentration of mitochondria, and it's because of the work that it needs to do. So it sort of sets itself up as a perfect trial basis of seeing whether or not you're going to affect change in the mitochondria. Let's take a look at this paper. Here's the abstract, and I want to focus on what they say here. Here we show that infrared wavelengths from sunlight can be measured after they pass through the human thorax. That means the chest. We then select a prominent transmitted solar wavelength range, and that's from 830 to 860 nanometers. This again is invisible light, and they deliver it to the thorax of subjects in the lab in controlled 15-minute exposures, with and without ocular involvement. So they basically will put a aluminum container over the head of these subjects to absolutely make sure that they cannot be exposed to this type of light. Clothing reduced wavelength intensity, but was not a barrier. These exposures were associated with significant improved visual function when measured 24 hours later, even in subjects in which the light was blocked from their eyes. So we're going to talk about this effect where you expose part of the body with infrared light and you actually get health benefits on another part of the body that was never exposed to that light. Our data show that longer wavelengths of sunlight penetrate through the human body and, consistent with animal studies, have the ability to improve function. While infrared light has been used on targeted tissues, its ability to improve distal tissues in humans has not yet been explored. This study also highlights the potentially important therapeutic value of sunlight, whose longer wavelengths can reach key organs even through clothing and likely promote mitochondrial function, counteracting the decline with age and disease. Now, that's an important point there at the end, is as you get older, theory of aging, specifically the mitochondrial theory of aging, states that ATP production in the mitochondria decreases by 70%. And so you can see here very clearly that if we can find ways of amplifying the amount of energy coming out of the mitochondria, we could actually affect change that might actually defy age. I want to mention a couple of papers that have been published prior to this one before we dive into it, showing very clearly that mitochondria in different tissues can communicate. This was a paper published in 2023, Intracellular to Interorgan Mitochondrial Communication in Striated Muscle in Health and Disease. And they said here at the bottom, myomitokinase, such as FGF21, GDF15, and mtDNA can alter whole body physiology and systemic responses. This is something that is not out of the ordinary. I may also draw your attention to this article that was published not too long ago, showing that, in fact, human blood contains circulating cell-free mitochondria. In other words, free-floating mitochondria. Notice what they say here in the article. Yet, using flow cytometry fluorescence assays, Stevens et al. Recently reported that at least part of the cell-free mitochondria of human and murine blood could remain functional. Indeed, part of the cell-free mitochondria identified by flow cytometry and mitotracker green fluorescence appear capable of maintaining a mitochondrial membrane potential, since they retained the tetramethylene rhodamine ethyl ester probe, and such retention was lowered by the addition of the mitochondrial uncoupler. That's all to say that these things could actually remain active even though they're not in a cell, which is crazy. Without any further ado, let's get into this article with that background that's very important in mind. So one of the first experiments they did was they had these subjects stand out in the sun at around noontime, and they did this without a shirt, and they measured the power of the sun at the level of the patient before it went into the patient. They measured that at 17 milliwatts per square centimeter. Then they had a detector on the other side that could measure how much of that light went through the thorax of that patient. The thorax of that patient is about 30 centimeters. And on the other side, they measured 5.6 microwatts per square centimeter. Now realize that these are different units. This is 1,000th of a milliwatt. And so you can see here that this is a very small amount of light that came through on the other end. You can see it here through daylight transmission through the thorax. Here's the blue, which represents how much light is going through the thorax of this patient. It's up here, and here's the scale on this side. And over here on this side, you can see a much smaller scale, but you can see also that the transmittance wavelengths and exactly where the gap was. Much of this visible light.
One of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right.
Could not penetrate through, and it was only once you reached about 600 nanometers that you started to see a penetrance through the body of the human being. Here we have it tracked down here once we hit about 700, that the amount of energy in these longer wavelengths start to increase and get longer and longer and peak right about 850 nanometers. Another way of thinking about it is if you look here at the difference between the blue and the red, what went in and what came out, the areas where there is the smallest difference, right about here, is the maximal area where you have the most amount of transmittance through the human body of this type of light. For this reason, they looked at this and they said, it looks as though for a human being, 850 nanometers, which is not visible light, it's in the infrared spectrum, but 850 nanometers is exactly the type of wavelength that seems to penetrate best through the human body. And you can see here, they looked at not only the absolute amount of energy that could go through in terms of transmittance, but also the relative amount. You can see the relative amount, we're talking 0.004%. A very, very small amount gets through. The majority of the light that hits the human body gets inside, bounces around, and gets absorbed. This type of a result is exactly what we would have predicted to see. We would estimate that a very small amount of light can get through the human body, and that type of infrared light is going to be absorbed by many different absorbers, but specifically what we believe is proteins and electron transport chains in the mitochondria. The next thing they did, because they found that 850 seemed to work the best, is they got a panel of LED lights that transmitted at 850 nanometers. And in this case, it was about half the strength at about 50 centimeters away from the subject. And again, they're going through the thorax, but about half the power that they did with the sun. They had a box with a detector at the other end, and there was such a small amount that came through that they were not able to measure the amount that came through in that situation. I leave this up here just to show you what it was for the thorax and what daylight transmission was. We weren't able to do the same for the 850 nanometer panel. However, they were able to show how much of a small amount it was. And you can see here the absolute value of what came through, and you can see here many more zeros after the decimal, and the percent. It was actually a very small amount of transmittance that was coming through. But it was detectable. And again, this showed that 850 nanometers, which is in the near infrared spectrum, can go and penetrate quite deeply into the body and even come out the other side. Then they did another experiment. And again here, what they're trying to see is whether or not this 850 nanometer light is actually affecting a physiological change in the body. So yes, they've shown that this type of wavelength can penetrate through the body. The next question is what is it doing once it gets in there? And that's exactly what they set out to do. And again, the reason why they looked at vision in this case is because vision, and specifically color vision, as we'll talk about, is very strongly tied to mitochondrial function in the retina. So they had 3 groups of people that got this 850 nanometers. The first one was the control group, which did not get any light at all. The LED lights were switched off. Of course, these people would not know that because they couldn't see it. First of all, it was on their back. And number 2, you can't see this light anyway. It's invisible to the human eye. The next group got exposed both to the head and the body. And the third group, the body only. They put this actually aluminum foil hat, if you will, over their head so that there was no way any of this light could have reached the person's head or eyes or anything like that. And then what they did was they checked their vision. And specifically what they're looking at here is color perception. The reason why this is the one that's tested is because color perception is so highly dependent on the mitochondria in the cones of the eyes. So if we take a look again, here's the eyeball. You can see here as light penetrates through the retina and all these neurons, it goes to the back, and that's where the photochemical reaction occurs back here, and it gets transmitted up here to the optic nerve and then to the brain. But let's zoom in on this area here. We have a lot of rods, as you can see here, these gray things. Those things are what is detecting light. But you also have these cones that are colored green, red, and blue. And that's what we want to talk about, because these cones are packed with mitochondria. And as you get older, these mitochondria don't work as well, but the cones are still there. And there are three types of cones. There are L cones, which typically pick up red light, and a red deficiency. So if you get worse red cones or L cones, the type of color blindness that you will have is something called protan, pro meaning the first. The next one are M cones. That's the middle. M stands for the middle range of visible light. And they kind of look for green. And because that's the second type, that color blindness, if you don't have those cones working very well, are called deutan. And then finally, the S or the short wave that pick up the blue are known as tritan or triton types of color blindness. Can we, through the administration of infrared light that nurtures mitochondria and allows them to produce more ATP, reverse or lower the threshold of people who have protan color deficiencies and tritan? Those are the ones that we're actually going to look at here in this experiment. So let's take a look at that. And here we see the results. So protan and tritan. So these are the cones that look for red light, and the ones here on the right are the cones that look for blue light. So here's our control. And as you can see, people that had whatever color blindness level that they had, it's not the genetic type of color blindness. We're just talking about the inability for those cones to work very well as you get older, which is normal. Notice that the control group, the people that did not get any of the 850 nanometer infrared light, there was no change. They were still at 100% of that threshold. However, those that got irradiated with 850 nanometers, 50 centimeters away from the panels, this is head and body that they're getting. Head and body irradiation. Notice that the threshold dropped statistically significantly down to this level. In the group that got only the body, they did not get any 850 on the head, there was a 5% drop. In other words, there was a reduction numerically, but it wasn't to the same degree as those that actually had it also going to the head. So this was not statistically significant with the 5%, but it was statistically significant with the 9%. Let's move on to the other type of color blindness, which was the triton. And again, the control group, there was no change from 100%. However, for those that get the head and the body irradiation, so hitting both places, there was a 16% drop in the threshold. That means that they were able to see differences in color much better when they had exposure to the head and the body of 850 nanometers light. That group that only had the body exposed, there was a reduction that was statistically significant, but it wasn't as much as those that got irradiation to both the head and the body. This is known as the abscopal effect. This means that mitochondria that are affected by light directly can seem to communicate this upregulation of energy production and cause an effect at an area distal to this. So this is actually really interesting. What we're seeing here, and what we've talked about for a few years, those people who are MedCram listeners and have been watching us, is that near infrared light, yes, it can penetrate through the skin. Yes, it bounces around throughout the whole body, which may cause the abscopal effect. But it seems as though we know that mitochondria can communicate with each other and get that effect of not just local reduced oxidative stress and increased ATP, but global. And that actually may be the reason why we saw in this video that we published back in late September of 2023 that there was a 27% reduction in glucose in these patients that were receiving light therapy. We know that this stuff can penetrate. This is a photograph that we've showed you before many times, but it was published in this article as well. Again, this is Bob Fosbury's hand, and you can see very clearly here that at 850 nanometers, there was a very good penetrance. What's interesting is that it either goes right through or around any of the bones, which you do not see. What does pick up the light, however, is deoxygenated blood. Notice how dark it is, and it can pick that up. The other thing that they looked at was the factor of clothes, which we've already talked about. They say that the transmission of light through clothing was mitigated here. Images were captured with a camera whose sensitivity covered the visual and infrared range. Each panel contains an image of light transmission through 1, a t-shirt, 2, another shirt, and 3, a woolen jumper all of them hanging on a hanger. So that's actually 6 layers. The left image here is ambient daylight. The middle image is backlit with an LED lamp, both photographed in visible only light. And also here on the right, the same as in the middle image, but taken with an infrared camera that looks at 750 to 1000 nanometers, passing only the 850 nanometer light from a 54 watt 660/850 nanometer Candir red light therapy LED lamp. This shows that the clothes are nearly 100 times more transparent at 850 nanometers than in the visible. The answer is the NIR light penetrates normal indoor clothing quite effectively. So what's very important to understand here that this paper that was just published in Nature shows us is that not only LED in the infrared light, but also sunlight even to a bigger degree can very easily penetrate through the skin and can have beneficial effects in the body, not just at the area where the rays of the sun are focused. And this is important because we are increasingly living in an environment where we are deprived of that very type of light. We live in buildings that have windows that are designed to filter out infrared light because that type of light heats up buildings and increases air conditioning costs. We also told you about a new rule in the United States that will go into effect in 2028 that will take LED bulbs and squeeze as much of what they call wasted energy, making these wavelengths that are invisible and only making wavelengths that are contributing to the lumens, because there's going to be a new threshold for making LED bulbs with much higher lumen to watt ratios. And while I do believe that it matters what type of lights you have in your home, Glenn Jeffrey did a study just showing recently that we haven't actually talked about, but we'll do a video on, that people who live in environments with LED bulbs who get switched out with incandescent bulbs in that type of environment actually get the same type of improvement that we are seeing here in this video. I'm all for getting the right type of bulbs, but nothing is going to beat, in any sense or form, getting outside and getting actually into the sunlight. I think that the article was outstanding. It was done very well, and I look forward to hosting Glenn Jeffrey on this channel so we can talk to him, and also Bob Fosbury. There are many other groups that are working on similar projects, and I expect that photobiomodulation is going to explode even more than it already has.